Everyone, we're just going to... Melina, everyone, we're just going to wait just one more minute until we start our session, just to let everyone come in. But thanks everyone for joining. Everyone, and welcome to the Kia Whiti Tonu series. I'd just like to ask Kevin Hanui, who's one of our panellists this morning, to open with a karakia.
Kia ora, Chloe. So to open our proceedings today, I have a karakia or ruruku, as would be on my Whanganui side. Nō reira tēnā tātou. Tēnei te ara kei runga, tēnei te ara e rangi, te ara o tēnei tupua, te ara o tēnei ariki, te ara o rangi rāua ko papa, rarau te pane o tāne, rarau te tangata ki raro kia, tīna, tīna, hui e, tāe ki e. Kia ora, Chloe.
Thank you, Kevin, for the karakia. So, ko Chloe Howard tōku ingoa. My name is Chloe Howard and I'm an associate with the Centre for Social Impact. I would like to welcome you all here this morning to the Kia Whiti Tonu series. This is a free program of 90-minute workshops offered to the community sector by the Centre for Social Impact through support from Foundation North. The Kia Whiti Tonu series of free online workshops was launched in November last year, responding directly to the need of capability and capacity building in community organisations as identified by the COVID-19 Impact Survey. The introductory program last year covered grant writing, marketing and comms, innovation, strategy and wellbeing. You can access the recordings and the PowerPoint from these sessions on the CSI website. These workshops were really well attended, and in March this year, we were delighted to announce that a further 8 free sessions will be presented this year. So far this year, we've had workshops on wellbeing, digital technology, and working with the media. You can also find these recordings, PowerPoints, and any take-home kits or resources from these sessions on the CSI website. We're aiming to make all sessions as accessible as possible, and for this reason, all of these sessions have been oversubscribed. So we'll be recording and making them available for you all. At the end of the session today, we will be asking for your feedback via a survey link in the chat. This is really important as it will help inform any future program delivery. The feedback from the last series has helped inform this year's offering. We really want to make sure that we can meet the needs of the sector. Before I introduce our session, I would like to ask you all to take part in a quick poll. It will ask if you've received funding from Foundation North in the last 2 years. Foundation North is supporting the series and they're really interested to see how many of their grantees are accessing these workshops. Let's give that a few more seconds. Today's workshop is a panel discussion on governance, what is keeping you awake at night, and it's presented by Judy Whiteman. Judy is a CSI associate. She is a facilitator, mentor, executive coach, board member and consultant in both the commercial and not-for-profit sectors. Judy is passionate about helping people achieve success for themselves, their people and their organisation. Judy has many years' experience in senior management and executive positions in the global financial services industry, both in New Zealand and abroad. She's been involved for over 30 years in the not-for-profit sector in several countries as a volunteer, board member and consultant. Judy has been a director, executive and non-executive on various boards. Her governance experience is a deep, diverse and over many years. She's currently an independent director with the Bank of India and New Zealand Limited and a trustee of the New Zealand Housing Foundation. I'd like to introduce Judy.
Thank you, Chloe, and welcome everyone. Wonderful that you can join us this morning. I thought to kick us off, it would be great to see who is online today. So can you please go into the chat box at the bottom of your screen? And first of all, when you get there, tick the all panelists and attendees option. And this way everyone can see your responses. And then just note in the chat box what town or city you're zooming in from today. Oh, we've got Wellington, Taupo, Palmerston North. Oh, it is going so quickly. Lots of Auckland, Rotorua, Gisborne, Tamaki Makaurau, Queenstown, Warkworth, Queenstown, Whakatane, Counties Manukau, Palmerston North. Oh, wow. It's great to see so many people from around the country on, and it just keeps coming. Wonderful. Okay, we might just leave it there. I also thought it would be good to run a quick poll at the start to give us a sense of the types of organisations online today. And for simplicity, we're using a financial measure, and that's your organisation's income or revenue. If you could just quickly tick which of those three categories you fall into, and then we can get a sense of who's here. We're just going to let this run for another few seconds. Okay, so we can stop the polling now, and let's see. So online today, 46% of you, your income is less than 250,000. So that puts you probably in around a tier 4 category when it comes to financial reporting. There's 23% of people are up to $1 million and 31% for over $1 million. So thank you for sharing that information. So you can see we have got a diversity of participants today. Now, as you know, we're going to look at governance of community organisations through the lens of what is keeping you awake at night. And I just want to say thank you so much for your comments and questions when you registered. Now, not surprisingly, these varied greatly. However, some themes did emerge, and those we're going to touch on today are the following: governance and management, strategy, financial stability, board membership and succession planning, risks and conflicts of interest. Now, as you have already provided us with your questions, we'll not be answering questions from the chat box today. However, I do encourage you to use the chat box to share your thoughts with other attendees about the areas we're discussing, and also share links to any relevant resources that you have. And just a wee reminder that in the chat box, if you can select all participants and attendees so that everybody can share in the information. Now, joining me today are two very experienced governors, and whilst you saw their detailed bios when you registered, I'd like to briefly introduce them to you. Now, first of all, there's Kevin Honui. Now, Kevin has 20 years governance and management experience in the community and not-for-profit sector, which he's applied to his voluntary service. And his service reflects a strong sense of social justice and improving outcomes for marginalised groups. His current governance or community roles are many and include the Marae Committee and Combined Trustee Marae Committee at the Hauariki Marae in Martinborough, a board member of the DCM Wellington Service, a trustee of Peora and Harata Blackburn Whānau Trust. And he's also an advisor to International Human Rights 2021 World Pride Conference, where the focus is on human rights of LGBTI Indigenous peoples. And Kevin is also a member of the steering group for the National Strategy Action Plan for NGO and Community Governance. So welcome, Kevin. Now, also joining us is Tanya Jones. Tanya is the MD of a coaching, consulting and training firm with a focus on early entrepreneurship and governance. And she's a committed volunteer for education, youth enterprise and community development issues. She has 20 years experience in the not-for-profit governance area across a variety of organisations, covering national, regional and local interests. Tanya is passionate and committed in supporting volunteering within New Zealand and also internationally. And currently she's the chair of Volunteering New Zealand, the founding chair of Youth Arts New Zealand and the deputy chair of Hutt College. And along with Kevin, Tanya is also a member of the steering group for the National Strategy Action Plan for NGO and Community Governance. So welcome, Tanya. Now to our first theme of governance and management. Now, not surprising that many of your comments came together under this theme. It has been and will continue to be something that is discussed. I mean, books have been written on it, and we could spend the whole webinar on this area. However, we're not going to. So just some key points to keep in mind before we get some conversation going with Tanya and Kevin. Key for board members is to remember that they have a fiduciary duty, and that is to act in the best interest of others. And they're also responsible to act in good faith, with skill, care, and diligence. And good governance is a way to deliver on these responsibilities. Now, governance is about how an organisation is run, and you can chunk the functions into areas of strategy, policy, financial oversight, managing management, risk management, and relationship management. Now, effective organisations understand the difference between governance and management. The board's role is to oversee management, not manage. So in other words, it leads, directs, and ensures. And the role of the manager or the staff or the volunteers is to manage, implement, and deliver. So understanding where your organisation sits on the governance management continuum is important. Now, of course, each organisation is different. And so how it is governed and where it sits on this continuum will vary from organisation to organisation. There is no one perfect solution. A board should look at an approach to governance that suits its organisation. So I think it would be good to hear from Tanya and Kevin around some of the questions you raised. So I'm going to start with you, Tanya. And how do you govern effectively when everyone involved in an organisation is a volunteer, or there may be only one part-time employee? I mean, where does the board sit on the governance management continuum?
Kia ora tātou. It's a big question, that one, Judy. Thinking about it, I think we need to break it into two different ideas. And one is governing effectively is one idea. And the other one is around volunteers and how you actually perceive them in your organisation. So for me, volunteers are not less than your paid staff. So thinking of your organisation as a whole is the key idea that I'd quite like to get across today. It's not that there's paid staff and volunteers, it's everybody working together for the benefit of the organisation. And that's, to me, what governing effectively is all about. It's taking on that stewardship role, forward-looking, being proactive, long-term thinking. And so that moves you off the management end of that continuum. So you're not doing the doing part. As governors, you're in the long-term, how is our organisation going to be looking in 5, 10, 20, 500 years, depending on what your organisation's purpose is all about. So I think around that governance responsibilities, it's around having clear role descriptions. So if you are on the smaller end of that financial scale that we've just been talking about, it's very likely that the people in your governance group are likely to be the doers of the doing of the service as well. So it's about being really clear of what you're talking about and when. So when to have your governor's hat on, when to have your doer's hat on, and being very clear around who's making decisions, making sure that that's agreed a process, so everybody knows how those decisions are being made and you've recorded them somewhere. So if one person leaves, people who come on the team after that know that this is how we do things here, can ask questions about that, but it's there's a process that's been documented in place. I think it's often, if you're on the smaller end of the scale and all of you are volunteers and you're doing the doing as well as running the organisation, I think a key thing for me is that you ask for help, you ask for advice, and you keep learning and you keep looking for ideas. Don't try and take on everything. Perhaps it's time to recruit more volunteers. You don't have to know them. They don't have to be in your friend group. You can put out an ad. You can ask on social media. There's templates and things around how to do that and best practice. Ask for more help. There's going to be people who are keen to join you in your work and in your service. But plan on how you're going to include those people if they are from outside your immediate group that maybe started it in the first place. So I think if you're a small organisation and maybe you have a part-time paid staff member, don't expect your paid staff member to volunteer as well. Their role is clear. You've outlined it in a job description. You've got an employment agreement. That's their role. Leave them to do that. If they wish to give you more of themselves and some of their time or their skill, then that's an absolute gift to your organisation, but don't expect them to do that. You have other people who have come on to do that in particular for you. So it's thinking about people in their roles, but being clear about expectations of each person and delegations to each person as to what it is that they're giving to the organisation and when. Yeah, I think for me it's thinking of governing is about long-term thinking and looking forward and being proactive and being open to new ideas about how to do things, and not making that that hard mindset of you've got paid staff, you've got volunteers, and you need to treat them differently. It's about treating all people in the organisation, delivering on that organisation's purpose.
Great, thanks Tanya. Some really helpful tips there of things to do, and really important around that, not having this hard distinction between volunteers and staff in how you treat and deal with people. So thank you for that. Now your turn, Kevin. How do you keep discussions at board meetings more strategic than operational?
Kia ora, Judy. I guess I'd start off by being a politician and putting some context in terms of my experience. So what I'm going to draw on today is really my experience working within a marae board level, which in this case is a small organisation with under $250,000 worth of turnover, te mea. So from that perspective, it's a group that includes both governance and operational issues at the table when that group meets. And what we do at that table is actually to separate our meetings into the first part of the meeting being around governance, and then the second part of the meeting being around operational issues. So that's one of the ways that we've started to recognise that there actually is a difference between governance and operational. And one of the ways that we'd recognise that is actually you've got to, from our perspective, we had to go backwards and ensure that we had looked at the strategic direction of what the marae wanted to do in order for us to then be able to see the context of governance as it relates to the vision, and then to be able to, as I say again, separate out the operational aspects from that. It wasn't an easy journey. It was one that took a long time to understand, because of course we're working within the capacity and the capabilities of the people around the table and the people that are there to do a particular role. And that's an ongoing learning experience. So I really agree with what Tanya has mentioned in terms of working within the capacity of the group, working within the capability of the group, recognizing the experience of the people that are there, but also recognizing if you need further assistance, there will be assistance available for the group. So that's a particular example of how, in that situation at the trustee marae level, we're able to look at governance issues and look at operational issues as best we can within a meeting agenda. So it's actually set in the agenda around having those two separate sort of sections to our meetings. And again, we've done that because that's the best way that it works, as we've learned in our situation. It may not be, of course, the ideal situation for others, but that's an example of how we've done it. Judy.
Thank you, Kevin. Really practical suggestions there. You know, I remember in my early days of learning around governance, this, you know, the textbooks say about governance and management, and your board needs to be this end, not that end. And so I've learned over time, you really just have to tailor it for your organisation. The key thing is that you have the conversations around the board table. Where are we on that continuum? Where should we be for how we're operating, and where should we get to over time, and how do we get there? So tailoring the governance management situation to work for your organisation. Okay, let's move on now and have a look at the next theme, which is strategy. Now, leading the strategic direction of an organisation is a core part of governance, and it involves defining what you want your group to achieve and making decisions on the best way to get it done. So that is, you know, what do we do? Who do we do it for, and how do we excel? And it's important that you tailor the strategic plan for the specifics of your organisation. There are lots of templates out there, but really there is no one size that fits all. Now, there are challenges through the process of developing your strategy and writing your strategic plan. And it's like, you know, how do you involve everyone? I mean, who is everyone who should be involved? How do you resolve differences in deciding on the strategic direction? What if some of your board members thinking we should go left and others are thinking we should go right? What is the pace of the work for the strategic plan? Do you have to get it all over and done with in a weekend, or can you spend time, you know, months and weeks working through it? And then how long should a strategic plan cover? What period? So, Kevin, I thought it would be helpful if you could talk to us about what some of the effective tools are that can be used for a successful strategic planning session, and how can smaller organisations access these tools?
In terms of accessing tools, I guess there are places available where you can do that. You know, and I think of the Department of Internal Affairs in terms of tools. But actually, what I'd like to talk about is some of the ways that some of the groups I've been involved with have used to engage our community, or the people that we are looking to work with, to inform us around the strategic plan. And that means a series of engagements, or that has occurred through a series of engagements, inviting people at specific hui to you know, come and give their comments, talk about their visions, providing a series of different ways for people to be able to engage. Because from my perspective, and from the experience that I've learned from our group, they informed the themes that started to develop around the strategic plan. Whether it's post-it notes, whether it's drawing pictures, whether it's talking, there's a whole lot of ways that one can use simply to gather the ideas of the communities that you're serving, and recognizing that you might serve a variety of communities. So there may not be just one particular identity, etc. There may be a series of communities, and there may be better ways to engage with them, whether it's through Facebook, social media, whether it's face-to-face. whether it's just inviting someone to come and have a talk to you. Those are some of the simpler methods that we've used to engage. And then presenting those ideas back in a visual form. We found visually it speaks very clearly to a lot of people. So I applaud Sport Wellington and what they did in terms of their strategic plan, copied them. So copy what others do too. I wouldn't be afraid to say that. I hope that's useful, Judy.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And it's just an example that there is not one size that fits all. And I love you encouraging people to copy others. I call it liberating, but there are quite a lot of resources out there around strategic planning. And some of them can be a bit too complicated and too overwhelming, but there are many resources that would be suitable for the range of organisations on this call today. So now, Tanya, I've got a raft of questions for you that came from the feedback. So it's like, how do you ensure everyone is involved, and like, who is everyone? And, you know, who leads the development of the strategy and the strategic plan? And, you know, what's the best pace for developing a strategic plan? So everything, all about strategic plans, every question you can probably think of that's ever been asked. Over to you.
Right. I think strategic plans are awesome. So we'll start from there, because they get everyone looking forward and getting conversations going about the purpose and the future of the organisation. So the strategic plan is not about the incremental day-by-day things that are happening. It's about lifting your horizon, lifting your eyes and looking, what do you want this organisation to be doing? What do you want it to look like down the track? And then working back from that with everybody. And everybody will have, I'm going to come to everybody in a minute, everybody will have their own ideas around what that is. So it's about corralling those ideas and then moving everybody together toward those. So it doesn't have to be an overwhelming, highly processed, frightening, we need to get in an expert who's done it 6 million times process. It is a discussion to have about where you want to be and what you want to be doing. So start with it as a conversation that you're having with people who all care about the same thing. And that makes it an easier conversation to start. And I certainly agree with what Kevin brought up, that there will be lots of different ideas and you'll need to try and extract them from lots of different people. And that will need to happen in lots of different ways. So think about your communication going out and think about how it is, what is it that you want to know from different people and how best would they give you that information. So if you want, an example is a school's strategic plan. If the way to engage with parents or caregivers is a post-it note or a whiteboard at the front gate as they're dropping their children at school, and there's one question, what do you want our school to be like in 5 years? And they have a whiteboard pen and they can stick something on, that's an input that is really valuable. And you might not get it if you put an online survey into the school newsletter. So just think about how you can make consultation with your wider audience easy for them to participate in. And it might be that drawing a picture is better for them. So think about how you can facilitate that. I also just wanted to get across the point that you can let yourself off the hook, that it's highly likely that you'll leave someone out. And so don't keep yourself in pause mode because you're trying desperately to find the names and addresses of everybody you think you need to consult with. It's better to start moving and start those conversations and add in a snowball fashion as you go, because all those comments are valuable as you go, so you can continue to bring them in with you. But starting off, and especially if it's your first time and you're a small organization doing it, it's okay. You're going to leave somebody out to start with, but as long as you continue being open and asking for ideas, that will be covered as you go along. The other thing I wanted to bring up was that conflict and dissenting points of view are not bad. And often they provide an opportunity for creativity to be sparked. So if you have everybody saying the same ideas, it's going to be, you know, it's a strategic plan that somebody could have written all by themselves. If you've got a dissenting idea coming in that people actually need to react against and think about, then that gives you a catalyst for some new thinking and ways of doing. So think wider than your normal day-to-day interactions and out into that everyone. Who do you impact? Think about where your impact lands. Who has an idea that potentially is at 90 degrees to where you are, to see if that sparks some new information, new ideas for yourself. So conflict isn't bad. It needs to be managed well, but it also gives you opportunities for some new ideas. Try to work out how the people that you are talking to around the strategic plan, how they view how change happens. Because often there's some hidden assumptions around how people think stuff happens. So some people might think that you lobby people in power positions. Some might think that street activism is the way to go. You might need to have a complete overhaul of your strategic plan, or you might just have, you know, slow incremental changes. So each person that you talk to is going to have a slightly different view of how change happens, and that's going to impact the information they give you for your strategic plan. So your organization as a whole needs to think about, our organization thinks that change happens for us like this, and be very conscious of that's the way you're thinking, so that when other people say things to you, you can see how that fits in with your thinking. And going on the pace of strategic planning, that's again, it's a one size doesn't fit all continuum. Some people might be able to whip one out because they've been kept awake by it at night for you know, years, and they could sit down and whip it out. This is what I want to do, and so my social enterprise is now going, and we're off. I've been involved in a process that actually took 12 months of workshops, of weekly and fortnightly workshops, where we all got together and actually started again from scratch to just sense check that we were, you know, serving the right purpose, and that our values were still what we thought they were from 5 years ago when we did it before, and went right back to the beginning and came back to just checked in on everything. So we had staff, we had whānau, we had children, we had external stakeholders, we had funders, and we went through a series of questions as to who we are and what do we believe in. So that was a 12-month process involving everybody we could possibly capture. But I've also been involved in a different process that started with the board having some tītiriti training, and we had input from members of the organisation, the wider sector, staff, and in staff I include volunteer staff as well, and the board. And so we started out with a day of workshop and training, and the board developed what they thought and then sense check it out with who it else belongs to. So I think that everyone is everyone who has an attachment or relationship with your organisation, and people who are impacted by your organisation in some way, including those who isn't necessarily a positive impact, because their voice is valuable as well. And be easy on yourself that you might not actually capture everybody as you start, but don't hold yourself back by trying to write the invitation list in a perfect way first.
Great. Thanks, Tanya. And both Kevin and Tanya, some great practical examples around strategic planning and emphasising that one size doesn't fit all, and you don't have to be perfect, and you can take your time. And I loved it, Tanya, that people can beg forgiveness afterwards if they have forgotten to include someone. That's a really good suggestion. Now let's move on to the next theme which came up, which was financial sustainability. Now, no surprises that you mentioned financial matters in various ways, because having enough resources to deliver mission is a core part of any organisation, even before COVID-19. Now, in the COVID-19 community survey last year, managing financial uncertainty was one of the widespread concerns. I mean, organisations experienced reduced funding or revenue, and maintaining financial viability at that time was a challenge. So, well, here we are, we're mid-2021. Let's do a pulse check as to where organisations stand today around financial stability. So we're going to run a couple of polls, and the first poll is coming up now, and it's saying, relative to a year ago, how financially stable is your organisation today? We're just going to let this run a little while to make sure everyone has an opportunity to contribute. Okay, we can sort of end the polling now. So what do we see? 37% feel that you are more financially stable than last year, 50% about the same, and 13% less stable. We'll go on to the next poll before I invite Tanya and Kevin into the conversation on this. So the second poll that we want to check in on is your level of reserves. Approximately what level of reserves do you hold today to sustain service provision? Got three choices there. We'll let this run a little while as well. It's nice to see that 6 months or more is winning the race at the moment. Okay, let's end the poll there and see where we stand. So 18% have 2 to 3 months, 25% of your organisations are 4 to 5, and 56% are 6 months or more. Now, well, what does that tell us when we see the results of those two polls, the way of looking at financial stability? I'm just going to invite Kevin and Tanya in to share us with your thoughts. You know, what was your initial response when you saw those results? And is that what you're hearing and seeing out in the communities that you're working with? So maybe, Kevin, would you like to go first?
Yes, I am somewhat surprised by the results. I guess in terms of the first poll, I had tended to think that financially organisations would be less stable in terms of the smaller organisations that I've been involved with as a result of COVID, actually, in terms of what they've been able to do, and also the sources of funding seem to have, whilst it was propped up last year, are starting to now dwindle away. So less stable and about the same. That was my expectation in terms of the poll. In terms of what level of reserves, again, 6 months or more is a fantastic result, but a surprising result still for me. But I think it is a fantastic result. 2 to 3 months, 4 to 5 months would have been my expectation as well. And for some small organisations, 2 to 3 months may be clearly beyond what they might have at the moment as well. So yes, I'd like to think that that if it's everyone's got 6 months or more or achieving that, then that's a fantastic sign of where groups are at the moment. But it would be interesting to know the breakdown of the sizes of those organisations around that as a thought. Kia ora, Judy.
Yes, it would, yeah. Now, just one thing to add before I ask Tanya for her insights. I had a quick look at the survey from last year around the level of reserves, and 2 to 3 months there were 20% of organisations sat there, 15% at 4 to 5 months, and 46% at 6 months or more. So some strengthening can be seen there, although it's good to see the 6 months or more increasing, but it is not unusual for smaller organisations that 2 to 3 months level of reserves, they feel that's the norm. That's what they learn to manage and operate within. So enough from me. Tanya, your response to the results, and what are you seeing and hearing out there?
I think I'm probably not surprised about the first poll, so not surprised that some are more stable. We have seen that some organisations are better off post-COVID because of government funding and increased funding pools available to them. So they've been able to not necessarily plan scaling up operations, but certainly have responded with scaled up operations. And so they've actually managed to utilise and leverage some of that government funding to be able to deliver more to their community. There seems to be that swing towards some organisations that got government funding and therefore are now quite stable, because finding operational funding is always the hardest part. You can find funding for projects in a number of ways, but operational funding is always tricky. And there's some that obviously are the smaller ones whose grant funding pool has dried up because some of those grants just got stopped for 12 months. And then there's some in the middle who are just hiding because actually they coped okay and they're keeping their head down and continuing on and not actually telling anybody anything. So I applaud everybody for still being in operation, because there's evidence around the world that a lot of volunteer involving organisations and community organisations have ceased operations globally. So well done to everybody who's still operating, and particularly if you're more stable now because you've leveraged what you were doing before, or you've used the catalyst to reconsider how you have income generation.
Thanks. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think I'm always amazed at the resilience of the community sector. I remember back when the GFC happened, there was an assumption that so many organisations would fold. I think there were thoughts along the same lines last year, but here the sector is, and the organisations in the sector are amazingly resilient in that. I'm going to move on now to look at board membership and succession planning. And this again is another big area. Lots of questions came up and lots has been written about it too. But a board's success depends entirely on the people sitting around the table and how they contribute their skills and perspectives to discussion and debate. And getting that mix right is really important. Now, we know there are ongoing challenges around finding people who are committed to be present and active, attracting and retaining talented people, and there's the ongoing challenge of developing the board's culture. You know, to have a board that really hums. I encourage boards to consciously consider succession planning and regularly be thinking about who's around their table and what do they need. Of course, a really important issue and getting lots of airtime these days is around diversity, but it's important to ensure that it's real and genuine diversity, not just tokenism. And of course, then how do you make sure that the voices of those you serve, that their voices are also heard around the table? Now, there were questions around, how large a board should be. And there has been research that says that smaller boards are known to perform better. I always encourage boards to have, to develop and implement a recruitment program and having a streamlined process so that you're very conscious of knowing what skills you're wanting and how you're going to go about finding them, recruiting people, not just taking the best, another board member's best mate, but being very conscious about how you recruit your board members. So I'm always on the lookout for potential board members for anything that I'm involved in. There were other questions around, how long is too long to be on a board, and should boards have tenure? And interestingly, research shows that a board member starts to lose their value around 5 years. And the other thing that we see in the sector is that some people are on many boards. So it's how many is too many? So Kevin, what does good succession planning look like to you? What are any top tips that you can share from your experiences that would be of interest to people?
So I think in my experience, good succession planning is underpinned by, and particularly for the smaller organisations that I've been involved with, is underpinned by a strategic outlook for that organisation about why succession planning is important. It's about having ownership about the fact that the organisation exists for a particular reason, and that that people clearly understand what the organisation is for, and therefore also understand what the role of the board members would be as part of that understanding. So for me, one of the tips around succession planning is actually communication amongst the whole organisation, the whole community, that it is an important part of the strategy around that organisation to continue the work of that and the aims of that organisation. So it is for me building a culture of good governance. I think that's probably underpins succession planning. It's about being able to engage different generations around governance planning leading on to succession. It's been able to understand the capacity of the organisation to also support the board in whatever level, and to be able to then communicate with board members and so forth. So there's a structure there that still needs to be taken into account as well. So I think from, those are things around succession planning. But it's strategic, it's ongoing. You're actively identifying people and skills, or identifying skills and expertise that you're wanting to hopefully have around the table, diversity and how that might fit in. But it's an active, ongoing strategy that the whole organisation understands is necessary for good governance of that organisation. I think those are probably some of the tips that I would have.
Thanks, Kevin. Now, Tanya, I'm going to do it to you again. I've got a raft of questions for you to tackle. You know, how long should someone be on a board? You know, should board have term or tenure limits? You know, board size, what's too big, what's too small? You know, the list goes on of all those questions. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, how long is too long is when you're stopped being active and you've stopped having new ideas. It's time to have someone new and somebody that has some fresh ideas. So the danger is that someone being on the board for so long and their ideas then taking prominence because they've been there and they've tried things and everybody follows the leader without thinking and asking questions. So I agree with the research that you talked about, Judy, that about 5 or 6 years, so a tenure of maybe 2 terms of 3 years or 3 terms of 2, depending on what your constitutional rules say. But I do think there needs to be tenure because often you'll find if a board member has done the limit of their term, they sort of feel a bit of relief that actually I can step down now and have a breather. And they probably wouldn't admit that to anybody, but if they can't see an out, you know, their felt obligation to that organisation is going to turn into a negative. So I think tenure is a good thing to have, and it refreshes the board and brings in new ideas. I agree with Kevin that succession planning is an ongoing process. It shouldn't be a surprise that your AGM comes up every year and it's time to nominate new board members. It happens every year. It shouldn't be a surprise. So the process of what skills is the board going to say in their advertising for nominations, or if you don't have nominations and elections by members, then the process of what skills do we need to help us deliver on our strategic plan is an ongoing process and should be a discussion that the board is having on a regular basis. Changing a board out completely is destabilizing for an organisation. So I think refreshing of board members needs to be a staged process, and think carefully about what can the organisation cope with. Can we cope with half the board changing out each year, or do we just want to change one at a time? So thinking about who's going to take the chair role, how much experience will that person need before you want them to take that chair role, those sorts of things. It needs to be an open conversation, and everybody needs to be willing to be vulnerable in saying, I don't want to be the chairperson until I've had 2 years under my belt of this organisation, so I understand some more. So it is an ongoing recruiting and an ongoing discussion for the board to have. And a test of that system is to ask the what if questions. What if so-and-so left? Are we prepared to pick up the task that they were doing? Does anybody know how they were doing that? Where have they stored that information? Those sorts of things. Asking the what if that person left is a good test. Personally, I like boards that are sort of, you can pair up so that you can buddy up the new board member with another board member. So that the induction process and the onboarding is much more streamlined, and they have somebody to ask some questions of. And remember that if you're a smaller organisation, not all of your volunteers or all of the people involved in the organisation need to be on the governing board. They don't need to be on the committee. It's okay if they just want to do some doing. So you don't have to feel like you have to invite everybody all of the time, because boards can then get very unwieldy and people are looking at issues with different lenses on. Somebody's looking at it with the operational, how am I going to do that on the ground? And others are looking at the, we want to be delivering that in 10 years' time. Yeah, I think boards need to be okay that they can increase over a period of time, so they can co-opt skills and experience that they need. But remember, to drop that down again. Don't just keep holding on to 16, 20 people because that's the way you've done it because you needed them all of a sudden. Just remember to go back down to what your constitution and rules state as a well-functioning board.
Tanya, I thought what I might do is just sneak in a wee poll here around board size, and you and Kevin can continue to talk if you like, but Amy's just going to run a little poll because I'm curious to know how many board members are currently on your board. Now, there's sort of 3 chunks there. It would have been, hindsight shows me I should have split the second category into all of them, but let's just get a sense there of the size of boards. And while that's happening, Kevin, you were wanting to say something else?
Yes, I'd forgotten the most recent experience that we'd had in terms of we actually invited people who might have been interested to be a trustee to a particular hui so that we could talk to them about who we were, provide some background to those people that were interested. They could also introduce themselves and what they thought they might be able to bring as a trustee to the marae in this instance. So it was it was an active move to look for prospective trustees and to spread that net for those that might have been interested and who were interested in being a trustee. But the point was, it was an active move to engage with prospective trustees and to provide some information for them then, not at the AGM or afterwards, but beforehand, so they were informed about the organisation and the role.
Thanks, Kevin. Look, what we're going to do is we'll put the results of that poll in the chat. It's just really curiosity and information for people to get a sense of board size. So if it's okay with the panel, I'm just going to move on to risk management now, because we can't ignore risks. So they're part of everyday operations, and you're managing risks is a key part of governance, and it covers monitoring, risk identification, mitigation and management. And I think it's helpful to think about risk management as part of your forward planning. And risks are wide ranging. They vary from organisation to organisation. There are some risks every organisation should have on their radar. And I think back to when the Health and Safety at Work Act of 2015 came into play, it certainly required boards to sharpen their governance focus around health and safety. And of course, right now, what's very topical is around cyber security. So those risks, I mean, when people were perhaps doing their risk analysis 6-7 years ago, would they have had cyber security in the top 10? Whereas today, it will be up there just because of what's happening too. So good governance practice around risk covers things like thinking about risks when you're setting your strategy, making risk management a standard agenda item at the board meeting. And this also gives you the opportunity to identify new risks from the diverse perspectives of board members, because everyone thinks about risks in different ways. It's important that the board consciously develops a collective appetite or tolerance for risk. What are the no-go areas for your board? Do you have conversations like that? And another way too is don't just think of all the downside of risks. When you're thinking about risks, also think about the opportunities that it's putting there in front of you. So one of the some of the comments that came through when you registered around risks and that were about managing volunteers. So I thought, Tanya, given your involvement around Volunteering New Zealand and others, what are your thoughts around managing volunteers from a risk perspective?
I'm going to bring that back again to it's not just about volunteers, it's about everyone in the organisation. So you shouldn't be trying to manage them separately. than anyone else who's involved. So it's about looking after the well-being and safety of everyone involved in your organisation in the same way. The difference with the volunteers is it might be a different motivation that gets them to turn up at your organisation than potentially some paid staff, but you still need to look after them in the same way. So I would encourage anyone looking at their risk identification to not think about the financial relationship that that person has with the organisation, but they're looking after them as their relationship to the organisation is a sustainable thing. So if they're turning up to serve at an event, you're thinking about I guess to demystify the risk management, start with what it is that you're delivering and work your way through from different perspectives. So think about if you were somebody attending the event, what are the potential things that could happen? If you're somebody running the event, what are some of the potential things that could happen? Work out the mitigation around that. So I think for me, this point was more about like the strategic planning. It doesn't have to be big and scary. It's about thinking forward and just carefully thinking what's in the best interest of the well-being of our people and their safety, and then working back around some of that. I think making the processes clear is the most important one. So it's not about compliance. It's about caring for your people.
Great, good comments. Thanks, Tanya. Now, Kevin, your thoughts around what are the best ways of recognising, managing and recording risk at a board level?
That was a topic that has been a difficult one for me to consider. But to put it simply, I think it is about starting on top at the board level. What's on top? What are the things that are at risk? So if you're understanding what your situation is in terms of the aims of your organisation and how you do that, then you, similar to what Tanya was mentioning, work from there, identify the things that need to be managed in terms of risk, and then ensure that they are covered through an agenda, through board meetings or so forth, to ensure that they are addressed in some way. So part of it is really, just putting it down. What's at risk here, or who's telling us what's at risk, and just identifying those things. Many of the things that you've already mentioned, Judy, are there, but it may not be so upfront for people, and so again, having access to these tools will help remind us what the risk management might look like. But I think for me, recognize it. So what's on top, do something to manage it, identify it, put it in an agenda or a document that keeps coming to the fore for the board to address, and then record what you might be able to do to mitigate that risk. So, around COVID-19, we had some procedures available to the communities, what to do, what not to do, how many people, so forth. So then look for things to help you mitigate those risks.
Great, thanks, Kevin. One thing that comes to mind as I was listening to you is organisations I've worked with, the frequency of when risk is on the agenda. Some will have their risk register and their heat map come every month. Some will do it quarterly. Some will do it in some other cycle. So I think what's important is for each board to think, well, for where we're at and the risk we're dealing with, how often should that be definitely put on our radar? And another thing that's really helpful when you do have your risk mitigation report, to help the board members should make sure that's clear to them, has the risk rating changed from the last time you saw it? Because you can get a lovely heat map, but if you sit there and you compare it to the last one, is it easy to see where there's been a change? So there's something in the reporting to help the board keep on top of what's happening with the risks that they've identified. And the other thing too is a process to ensure that new risks are added as they come up, that you just don't think, oh, this is our list of risks and there aren't going to be any more. It's always great when a risk comes off or it goes from, say, red to green, but we've always got to keep remembering to check for new risks as well. Now, I think I'm looking at the time, we're getting close to our final theme that came up, which is a goodie, which is around conflicts of interest. So understanding and dealing with conflicts of interest is fundamental to good governance. And New Zealand is a small place and conflicts of interest are common. And my view is that having conflicts of interest is not the main issue. What I see is the issue and key is how those conflicts are identified and how a board deals with them. Now, there are some good governance practices, about having the board's policy around how to deal with the conflict of interest, having some standing items on your agenda, your interest register, and consciously asking each meeting, has there been a change? Also consciously asking at the start of each meeting, is there a conflict of interest around anything that's been in relation to anything on the agenda? So, and there are several resources around to help you deal with conflicts of interest. A really important thing that boards sometimes forget is to ensure that any of the conflicts are recorded in the minutes, including how the conflict was dealt with. Yeah, don't leave it for people to guess. So, Kevin, how do you assess a conflict of interest?
Another hard one, actually, particularly in my experience around the marae situation, because everything is so close in terms of people having particular interests and board members having particular interests in what is going on at the marae. So it's quite a pointed exercise, actually, to be asking those questions, particularly for the issues on the table that are being discussed, to ask that question specifically, but also to have some foresight, if you're able to, around what possible interest the board member might have in that, and that you might need to check in with that board member during the meeting in an appropriate way, in a non-threatening way, so to speak, just to check in that if they realise that there might be a possible conflict of interest. Better to declare and to say no, or something like that, rather than to be ignorant of possible conflicts of interest. So really giving the opportunity for people to declare conflicts of interest, giving the opportunity for people to be comfortable about, and I don't want to say dobbing yourself in, but really be comfortable about saying, is this a conflict of interest? I think that is a good way to approach that. But then to also have a discussion about how that might be mitigated, and then recording it in some way, as you mentioned, Judy, so that people are aware, so that it's transparent. I think that's the main thing, is just around transparency, around potential or actual conflict and the way that's mitigated.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Now, when the three of us were talking and preparing for the session, Tanya, I'd asked Tanya to think about that, How do different interests lead to conflict? And she has an interesting take on this. So I think she might give some traditional responses about the types of interests that lead to conflict, but she has another interesting perspective as well. So over to you, Tanya.
Thank you. I want to again refer back to what Kevin has said. It is about being open and honest about your own interests, and it's for smaller organisations, it might be easier to think of it as that you're declaring your involvements with other things. And in some ways that makes it a bit easier, and it also offers you an opportunity. So as you join that board and you're involved with 6 other different organisations as well, so it expands the opportunities for the new organisation to potentially have some collaboration there as well, not necessarily conflict. So a conflict would be if you were if you ran a contracting business and your organisation was putting out tenders for some work to be done, and your employer or your company wanted to put in a tender for that. So that's a type of conflict. I think being aware of if you're involved in multiple organisations, the possibility of competition between those organisations, potentially for funding or for tenders or for service or for targeting particular populations, that competition is a potential conflict of interest as well. And it is okay to say, I have a conflict of interest here, but then maintain confidentiality, and you don't have to say anything else. If it's under embargo, or you know some information because of another board meeting you were in, you need to maintain confidentiality in that instance as well. So in saying that, you also need to be comfortable, like Kevin said, of saying, I need to step out of this discussion, and actually following through on that position of not then participating. If that's how the conflict is dealt with your board, it might be that they take your statement and then you don't participate any further, but are allowed to stay in the room. So again, not a one-size-fits-all situation there, but it's about declaring involvements. And I sort of encourage people to just declare everything, and then we'll check in each meeting if anything on our agenda sort of flags for you that you've actually involved in that in a different way. So what Judy mentioned was, I came at it with a slightly different one, and I think I mentioned it a bit earlier, that your organisations might see things differently. So they might have some assumptions and values or thoughts around how change happens, or how to, even how to treat people, who's involved and who's not, and all those sorts of things. So as you move from one organisation to another, so if you're involved in several organisations, remember the culture of the organisation that you were sitting in at the time when you have the discussions, because you need to be the steward of that organisation at that time. So think about who you are being a steward for, the organisation that you are being the steward for in that situation, and they value these things. They believe things happen like this. So potentially as an individual board member, you might have a conflict of ideology, a conflict of belief in how things happen in your different organisations, and that's an internal tussle you'll need to have, and potentially you'll need to declare that to your board as well, to say, I'm struggling to see this side of this issue. Can we talk about it a bit more, just to tease that out, because I'm coming at it like this. And so then have that open conversation with the rest of your board about that issue, rather than sitting back and saying nothing. it's that opportunity for creative thinking to happen. Potentially the other board members haven't thought of it that way. Yeah.
Thanks, Tanya. That's certainly given people another way to think about conflicts of interest. There, you can see on the PowerPoint, there is a link to a very simple, basic resource that helps you understand around conflicts. I always say, look, if in doubt, raise it, have the discussion. It's better to have had it and the discussion and everybody going, yep, that's okay, we understand it, we don't think there's a conflict, rather than you sit on something and then when it does come up, it could cause an issue. So conflicts are always going to be there. It's a matter of getting comfortable in dealing with them. Don't run away from them. Now, I'm just doing a little quick time check. And I think what we might do here, it's like a little bonus for everybody. When the three of us were talking about the issues and the themes that had come up from the information you provided when you registered, it didn't come up much, but there was some reference around youth on boards, because over the last few years, there's been more awareness around youth on boards from many perspectives. And I thought that Kevin and Tanya, because of some things that have been happening for them, might share with you some things that they're aware of in the youth space. So Kevin, there was something that you said there are youth groups around who are wanting to know more about governance. So what's that about?
So yes, and some of my feedback and interactions with the youth groups and youth leaders is that they are small organisations. A lot of them are leading those organisations themselves and recruiting from within the demographic that they're serving, and they are really interested in knowing more about how to govern well and how to to learn those things that we're learning or we've experienced in order for the organisation to function better, but particularly around governance, that I'd like to access more information around that.
Thanks, Kevin. Now, Tanya, you've got something to share, haven't you, from Volunteering New Zealand?
I do. And I think first we need to acknowledge all the young governors out there, because, we've got lots of older people who just say, I don't want to go on a board, it's too much work. So firstly, a shout out to all the young people on boards, because we do know it's hard work, but it's also a lot of fun as well. So Volunteering New Zealand has just established a youth working group, and because we're looking at one question, how can governance be done differently, and how can youth voice be heard and involved in that? So there's sort of quite a lot behind that question, and our youth volunteers on that working group are doing lots of work behind the scenes to get that information back to us to have a look at, to see how our Volunteering New Zealand members and the rest of the wider sector could learn from some of the things that they're bringing back. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of youth on boards, and I'm constantly astonished by their enthusiasm and their work ethic and their drive. They're quite exhausting. But it's there, I think, and I've come a long way myself in my thinking around youth on boards. It's not about how old they are, and it's not about their CV. It's about the perspective that they bring and the opportunity for new thinking and the questions that they ask that make the older board members be challenged on their thinking and the ways of doing things that they've done without challenging them for a period of time, that make them reflect on actually what are we doing and why are we doing it that way. So I've got a shout out to Youth Arts New Zealand, run by some wonderful young people who are doing some great things up there in Auckland as well. So hopefully at the Pivot Conference, Volunteering New Zealand Conference in October, on the 21st of October, in Wellington, you can be part of shaping the future of volunteering, and hopefully you'll hear from the youth working group then, if not then very quickly after that. And if anybody has some keen and enthusiastic youth, to send them our way as well, so we can capture their ideas too.
Thanks, Tanya. Like you, I have been blown away when I've been on a board with a youth. I've been blown away working with a board where 50% of the board were had to be under 25, and that energy and enthusiasm and just the different way of thinking that's added in, puts us oldies to shame sometimes. So I'm all for this, the work that you're doing, growing to support youth on boards. Now, I'm just doing a quick look at time, and I think what I might do is to, Kevin and Tanya, I think it's a wrap-up time. I'd just like to give you an opportunity to leave a thought around community governance. What thought would you like to leave with everyone today? So, Tanya, I'll go to you first.
I think for me, you need to be a steward of the organisation that you're involved in. You need to feel a compulsion to look after it for the future. If you don't feel that and you're just there for something on your CV, that maybe reflect on why you're sitting around that table.
Thanks. Kevin.
So I guess the final thing I'd like to add is just to be aware of the legislative requirements around which your organisation works, and the requirements for trustees, and that for Māori organisations there may be additional ones that you need to be aware of as well. So I'd just like to add that.
Thanks. And if I can add in my thoughts is, I wouldn't want anyone to be scared off from being a governor in a community organisation. It's a wonderful experience. Don't be afraid to ask for help and ask for information. The challenge is there is so much information out there, having the time to go through it. But you will know people in the sector that will know what it is you need to know about. So reach out to people. Don't let some of the obligations around being on a board put you off considering it. It's well worth it. So look, now before we go into some final things, I just would like to thank both Kevin and Tanya for coming in today and joining me on the panel. I think everyone would have been thoroughly sick of my voice if it had just been me today, but I really appreciated your engagement around us developing the themes and providing your perspectives and input to the questions that came up through the process. So thank you so much. We really value it. Now, what we're going to do is, before we leave, there's going to be a wee survey, and also we'll close with a karakia. But I do need to mention that, just to remind you that the presentation will be available afterwards. There's a kite of resources which builds on some of the things we spoke about today. And I think Chloe mentioned to you that the webinar is recorded and will be available on the CSI website. So all the resources are there available for you, and you can look back on them anytime. So now I think what we might do is, if I just ask someone from the CSI team, they're going to pop a little survey link into the chat box. And we'd love you to take a moment to answer the questions there. And I would just highlight that there's a box there for suggestions for other areas that you'd like sessions around. Please do take the advantage of that. If I reflect on the feedback that came through registrations, whilst it might not have been mentioned by lots of people, there were references to understanding Māori governance, integrating Te Tiriti into an organisation, youth governance we've just heard about. So I'm sure there are many other things in your mind. Please do put them in the survey. So I'll just allow you a couple of moments there to complete that survey. And if for some reason you can't get the link to work, I think when the team sends out the resources to you, there'll be the link again so that you can contribute in that. Okay, well, I think what we will do now is wrap up the webinar. I would like to say thank you also to everybody who participated. I hope you found it useful. Please do share the resources with others who may not have been able to attend. Okay, so Kevin, if I can pass over to you to close us for the session.
Kia ora, Judy. Kia ora tātou. So before I close our hui today, our thoughts are with those in Canterbury and down in the South Island who may be under duress because of the weather. But I hope everyone around the country are well, and we look forward to engaging with you again. So, nō reira, this particular karakia, to close our hui, kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turuki te whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e. Kia ora tātou.